What would you do if you knew the person sleeping next to you was planning to have you committed to an asylum just to steal your fortune? Would you scream? Would you run? Or would you do what Scott Wainwright did? He played the long game. He let them humiliate him. He let them judge him. He let them think they had won. For 700 days, he played the role of the invalid husband while secretly recording their crimes. The climax of this story isn't a gunfight or a car chase. It's a terrifyingly quiet moment at a charity gala where a blind man suddenly sees everything. This is a story about the devastating power of the truth and why you should never, ever betray a man who understands patience. Stick around until the end to see the brutal files he drops on the table that sent them both to prison for 20 years. The evening air above Napa Valley was thick with the scent of crushed velvet, expensive perfume, and the overarching, intoxicating aroma of fermenting grapes. From the high limestone balcony of the Wainwright estate, Scott Wainwright looked down upon the sprawling lawn where the elite of California society had gathered like moths drawn to the golden light of a burning flame. They called it the Crimson Harvest Gala, the most exclusive event of the season, a night where charity was the excuse and vanity was the currency. To Scott, it looked less like a celebration and more like a wake, though the guests below, clinking their crystal flutes and throwing back their heads in manufactured laughter, were entirely unaware that they were mourning the death of a dynasty. Or at least, that was what they believed. Scott tightened his grip on the railing, the rough stone biting into his palm. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than most of the cars parked in his driveway, yet he felt like an imposter in his own skin. At 38, he should have been in his prime, the titan of the wine industry, the man with the golden nose. Instead, he was the ghost of Wainwright Vineyards. He watched the crowd part as a waiter navigated through them with a silver tray, and he could almost hear the whispers carried on the wind, sharp and acidic. They were talking about him. They always talked about him. They said Scott Wainwright had lost his mind, that the accident 2 years ago had robbed him of his legendary senses, his smell, his taste, the very tools that had built this empire. They whispered that he was a husk, a recluse who spent his days staring at empty barrels, leaving the business to the capable hands of his wife and his best friend. He let them whisper. In the world of fine wine, silence was often mistaken for emptiness, when in reality, it was part of the aging process. Below him, the music swelled, a live string quartet, playing something melancholic and sophisticated, fighting to be heard over the roar of conversation. Scott took a slow breath, closing his eyes. The rumors were wrong. He had not lost his senses. If anything, they had sharpened, honed by isolation and pain until they were razor-edged. He could smell the ozone of the coming storm, the damp earth of the vineyards miles away, and the metallic tang of caviar from the buffet tables. But mostly, he could smell the treachery. It hung in the air, heavier than the humidity, a cloying scent that coated the back of his throat. The glass doors behind him slid open with a soft hiss, breaking his solitude. He did not turn around. He knew the cadence of those footsteps. They were light, rhythmic, and practiced, the footsteps of a woman who treated every surface she walked upon as a runway. "Scott," a voice called out, soft and laced with a performative concern that made his stomach turn. "Darling, what are you doing out here in the dark? The investors are asking for you." Laurel Simmons stepped onto the balcony. Even without looking, Scott could picture her perfectly. She would be wearing the scarlet gown they had selected together weeks ago, back when he was still pretending to care about the pageantry. The dress was designed to make her look like the literal embodiment of a crimson vintage, bold, structured, and commanding attention. She moved to his side, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. Her touch was cool, lacking the warmth of intimacy it had once held. He turned to look at her. She was breathtaking, in the way a poisonous flower is breathtaking. Her blonde hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing the diamond necklace that glittered at her throat. Her eyes, blue and piercing, searched his face, not for affection, but for compliance. "I needed air," Scott said, his voice raspy. He played the part well, the weary, broken man. The noise inside. "It is too much tonight." Laurel sighed. a sound of perfectly curated patience. She reached up and adjusted his bow tie, her fingers lingering near his neck. I know, my love. I know it is difficult for you. But this is the night of the last drop. We need you to just stand there and look like the genius they remember. Grant and I will handle the rest. You do not have to say a word if you do not want to. Grant and I, she had said. The pairing of those names came so naturally to her now, rolling off her tongue with an ease that should have been alarming. Where is Grant? Scott asked, keeping his expression vacant. He is downstairs, charming the board of directors, Laurel replied, a small, proud smile tugging at the corner of her lips. He is doing everything he can to save the company, Scott. You know how hard he works for us. Scott nodded slowly. For us. Yes. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the heavy oak doors opened wider, and Grant Holloway stepped out into the cool night air. He brought the noise of the party with him, a burst of laughter and clinking glass, before the doors slid shut again, sealing them in the quiet. Grant was the picture of modern success, tall, charismatic, with a smile that could disarm a firing squad. He held 2 glasses of red wine in his hands. There he is, Grant boomed, his voice jovial but carrying an undertone of tension. The man of the hour, hiding in the shadows. Laurel, did you find him? He is just overwhelmed, Grant, Laurel said, her tone shifting to one of protective matriarch. Please, be gentle. Grant walked over, extending one of the glasses toward Scott. Here, drink this. It is the 2018 reserve. It will calm your nerves. You do not have to taste the nuances, Scott. Just drink it for the alcohol. You look like you need it. The insult was wrapped in kindness, delivered with a smile. They mocked him to his face, believing he was too dull to understand the slight. Scott took the glass. The liquid was dark, almost black in the moonlight. He held it by the stem, swirling it gently. The legs of the wine dripped down the side of the crystal, slow and viscous. Thank you, Grant, Scott said. You have always been thoughtful. Grant stepped closer, clapping a hand on Scott's shoulder, squeezing it with a camaraderie that felt like a shackle. We are a team, buddy. Always have been. Since Stanford. Look, tonight is going to be tough. We are going to make some announcements about the restructuring. About your medical leave. It is for the best. Laurel and I have gone over the paperwork. We just need you to trust us. Scott looked from Grant to Laurel. They stood close to each other, their body language mirroring one another. It was subtle, but to Scott, it was screaming. The way their feet pointed toward each other. The way the air seemed to charge between them. But it was not just visual. It was the smell. Scott inhaled deeply, a micro-movement that neither of them noticed. He caught the scent of Grant's cologne, a musky, expensive blend of sandalwood and leather. But underneath that, clinging to the lapel of Grant's tuxedo jacket, was something else. A floral note. Jasmine and oud. It was distinct. Rare. It was the custom perfume that Scott had commissioned for Laurel in Grasse, France, 3 years ago. A scent that no other woman in the world possessed. And it was on Grant's jacket. It was not a stale scent from a casual hug earlier in the day. It was fresh. The top notes were still volatile, meaning the contact had happened recently. Very recently. Perhaps in the 15 minutes since Laurel had claimed she was checking the catering arrangements. Scott's heart hammered against his ribs, a drum of war beating in the silence of his chest. He looked at the wine in his glass. He saw the sediment swirling at the bottom, the dregs, the impurities that usually settled when a bottle was left undisturbed. They thought he was the sediment. They thought he was the waste product to be filtered out so they could enjoy the clear, profitable liquid of his legacy. Trust, Scott repeated the word, tasting the iron in it. That is a heavy word, Grant. It is the only word that matters, Laurel said, stepping closer to Grant, her shoulder brushing against his arm. The contact was brief, electric, and entirely inappropriate for a wife standing next to her husband. We are doing this for you, Scott. So you can rest. So you can heal. Scott looked up, his eyes locking with Laurel's. For a second, the mask almost slipped. He wanted to shatter the glass in his hand, to drive the jagged stem into the lie standing before him. He wanted to scream that he could smell her betrayal on his best friend's clothes, that he knew they had been skimming profits from the distribution deals in Asia, that he knew the last drop auction tonight was a farce. But he was a winemaker. He knew that patience was the difference between vinegar and vintage. You cannot rush the harvest. You have to wait until the sugar content is at its peak, until the grape is bursting, ready to be crushed. "I am ready," Scott said softly, lowering his gaze back to the glass. "Let us go downstairs. Let them judge me." Grant exhaled, a sound of relief. That is the spirit. Just stand there, look dignified, and let Laurel do the talking. She has prepared a speech that will bring tears to their eyes. "I am sure she has," Scott murmured. "After you." Grant gestured toward the door. Scott turned and began to walk back toward the light and the noise. As he passed the threshold, he paused for a fraction of a second. He brought the wine glass to his lips, not to drink, but to breathe. He smelled the oxidation in the liquid. The wine Grant had handed him was open yesterday. It was flat, careless. They had stopped trying to impress him. They had stopped fearing him. That was their mistake. Scott walked into the ballroom, the heavy bass of the conversation hitting him like a physical wave. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. He saw pity. He saw mockery. He saw the vultures circling, waiting for the carcass to fall. Laurel linked her arm through his, her grip tight, steering him like a child. Grant flanked his other side, the loyal lieutenant. They walked him toward the stage, toward the bright lights that would blind him, toward the microphone that would amplify his silence. Scott walked with his head bowed, not in shame, but in concentration. He was cataloging every scent in the room, every whisper, every lie. The sediment in his glass had settled. The wine was clear. And tonight, he would finally uncork the bottle he had been cellaring for 2 long, agonizing years. The judgment was about to begin, but the verdict had already been decided. Not by them, but by him. "Are you okay?" Laurel whispered in his ear, her breath hot and smelling of mints used to mask the wine she had shared with Grant in the shadows. "Never better," Scott replied, and for the first time in years, he meant it. The descent into the Wainwright cellar was a journey into the belly of the earth, a transition from the manicured, artificial brilliance of the ballroom to a silence so profound it felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. Laurel Simmons slipped through the heavy oak door first, her scarlet gown rustling like dry leaves against the stone archway. Grant Holloway followed a heartbeat later, checking over his shoulder with the twitchy paranoia of a man who knew the cost of being caught before pulling the door shut. The click of the latch was deafening in the sudden quiet, severing the connection to the galley above. Here, the air was different. It was kept at a strict 55 degrees Fahrenheit with 70% humidity, the perfect environment for aging premium Cabernet, but a chilling climate for skin exposed by evening wear. The atmosphere smelled of damp limestone, ancient dust, and the sweet, woody breath of French oak barrels breathing in the dark. It was a cathedral of wine, a subterranean labyrinth where Scott Wainwright had spent the better part of 2 decades communing with grapes and yeast, treating them with a reverence he rarely showed to people. To Laurel, however, this place had always smelled like money buried in the dirt. She moved deeper into the shadows, her heels clicking a sharp, staccato rhythm on the concrete floor. She did not hug herself against the chill. She embraced it, letting the cold sharpen her focus. Grant caught up to her near the reserve library, a caged section where bottles dating back to the 1940s slept in dusty rows. He looked less composed than he had upstairs. The facade of the charming CEO was melting under the heat of his own anxiety, leaving behind a man who looked sweaty and slightly desperate. "Did anyone see us?" Grant asked, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. He loosened his bow tie, the silk strip hanging limp around his neck. "Relax, Grant," Laurel said, not bothering to turn around. She ran a manicured finger along the dusty shoulder of a Methuselah bottle. "Everyone is too busy eating the caviar and drinking the swill we serve them to notice. Besides, if they did, they just think the devoted wife and the loyal business partner are having a private crisis meeting about poor, sick Scott." Grant leaned against a stack of barrels, exhaling a long, shaky breath. "He was weird tonight, Laurel. Did you see him on the balcony?" The way he looked at the wine? For a second, I thought. Thought what? Laurel spun around, her eyes flashing in the dim amber safety lights. That he smelled the truth? Don't be ridiculous. The man is a husk. The neurologist said the trauma to his olfactory nerve was permanent. He hasn't smelled a thing in 2 years. He is just acting out the muscle memory of a winemaker because that is all he has left. He is pathetic. He asked about the wine, Grant insisted, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He said it was flat. He knew I opened it yesterday. A lucky guess, Laurel scoffed, walking over to him. She reached out and smoothed the lapel of his jacket, her touch possessive and commanding. He knows you. He knows you are lazy with the details when you are stressed. Stop looking for ghosts, Grant. We are at the finish line. In less than an hour, the board will have the medical dossier. They will have no choice but to invoke the incapacitation clause. Scott will be removed as chairman, I will be appointed as proxy, and we sign the sale agreement with the Chun Group by morning. Grant looked down at her, his eyes searching hers for the confidence he lacked. And the toxicology report? The one we forged? It is perfect, Laurel whispered, her voice a serpentine hiss. It shows a consistent pattern of prescription drug abuse and cognitive decline. It paints a picture of a man who is a danger to himself and the legacy of the vineyard. They will thank us for saving the company. They will think we are heroes for carrying this burden for so long. She leaned in, kissing him. It was a hungry, aggressive kiss, fueled not by romance, but by the shared adrenaline of their conspiracy. It tasted of the expensive champagne they had been sipping earlier and the metallic tang of ambition. Grant responded, pulling her closer, his hands gripping her waist as if she were the only thing keeping him from drowning. For a moment, in the cool darkness of the cellar, they were just two thieves celebrating a heist before the vault was even open. But Grant pulled away first, breathless. He looked around the cellar, his eyes darting to the black domes of the security cameras tucked into the corners of the ceiling. The cameras, he muttered. Are you sure? Disabled, Laurel lied smoothly. She hadn't actually checked, but she knew Scott hadn't looked at a monitor in months. I told security to cut the feed to the lower levels for maintenance during the party. I told you, I have thought of everything. You just need to hold it together for one more hour. Can you do that? Can you be the man I need you to be? Grant straightened up, his ego stung by her tone. I have been running this company for 2 years, Laurel. I have been cleaning up Scott's messes. I deserve this. We deserve this. Exactly, Laurel purred. She stepped back, turning to look at the rows of barrels that stretched into the darkness. Each one contained thousands of dollars of potential revenue, liquid assets that Scott treated like children. She hated this place. She hated the pretension of it, the waiting, the patience. She wanted the payout. She wanted the penthouse in Manhattan and the villa in Como. She wanted a life that didn't smell of dirt and fermentation. It is ironic, isn't it? Grant said, a cruel smirk finally returning to his face as his confidence rebounded. He walked over to a testing table where a wine thief, a glass pipette used to extract samples from barrels, lay on a silver tray. He picked it up, twirling it in his fingers. He spent his whole life trying to make the perfect bottle, the last drop, and now his legacy is going to fund our retirement. We are going to sell off his library, sell the land for development, and erase the name Wainwright from the valley. He erased himself, Laurel said coldly, when he stopped being a husband and started being a vegetable. I am young, Grant. I have needs. I have a life to live. I refuse to be buried down here with him and his bottles. She walked over to a nearby barrel, labeled Cabernet Sauvignon, Block 4, 2021. This was Scott's pride and joy, the vintage he had been working on right before the accident. Laurel tapped her fingernails against the wood. Do you think he suspects about us? Scott. Grant laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Scott doesn't suspect that the sun is going to rise tomorrow unless you tell him. He trusts me. He thinks I am his brother. That is the beauty of it. He is so arrogant in his own genius that he never thought for a second that the people closest to him could outsmart him. He thinks he is the chess master, but he doesn't even know he is off the board. Laurel smiled, a slow, predatory expression that didn't reach her eyes. Good. Let's go back up. I want to see his face when the announcement is made. I want to see that confused, lost look in his eyes when he realizes he has lost everything. It will be exquisite. She turned to leave, but stopped. On a small tasting table in the corner, there was a single, empty wine glass. Next to it sat a bottle of unlabeled wine, corked but open. It looked out of place, as if someone had been here recently. "Grant," she said sharply, "did you leave that there?" Grant looked over, squinting in the dim light. "No, I haven't been down here in a week. Maybe the cellar master?" Laurel walked over to the glass. She picked it up. There was a tiny amount of red residue at the bottom, still wet. She brought it to her nose. It smelled of nothing, just wine. But a shiver ran down her spine, a primal warning that she couldn't quite decipher. She looked at the bottle. It was cold. "Someone was here," she whispered. "Probably just the staff prepping for a tour," Grant dismissed, checking his Rolex. "Come on, Laurel. We are wasting time. The investors are waiting." Laurel hesitated, looking into the dark recesses of the cellar. The rows of barrels seemed to stand like silent sentinels, watching, judging. For a split second, she felt a gaze on her, heavy and oppressive. But there was only silence. The hum of the cooling unit was the only sound. She shook her head, dismissing the paranoia. Grant was right. They were winning. There was no room for fear. "You are right," she said, setting the glass down with a decisive clink. "Let's go finish him." They walked back toward the stairs, their arms linking once more. As they ascended, leaving the sanctuary of the cellar behind, they did not notice the faint, red light blinking rhythmically on the small, concealed device tucked behind a row of 1982 Bordeaux bottles. It was not a security camera. It was a high-fidelity audio recorder, its digital tape spinning silently, capturing every word, every sneer, every admission of guilt. And deep in the shadows of the far aisle, hidden behind the towering stacks of oak, a figure stood perfectly still. He blended into the darkness so completely he seemed to be part of the architecture. He did not move. He did not breathe loud enough to be heard. He simply waited, his eyes adjusted to the dark, watching the heavy door close at the top of the stairs. Scott Wainwright stepped into the amber light. He looked at the door where his wife and best friend had just exited. His face was a mask of stone, devoid of the confusion or weakness they had mocked. He walked over to the table where Laurel had touched the glass. He picked it up, holding it by the stem, and brought it to his nose. He could smell her perfume on the rim. He could smell the fear in Grant's sweat that lingered in the air. He could smell the rot of their souls. "Block 4, he whispered to the empty room, his voice steady and cold. "Ideally paired with red meat. Or in this case, a slaughter." He set the glass down. The cellar was no longer a place of mourning. It was an armory, and he was ready for war. The silence of the cellar was a heavy blanket, but for Scott Wainwright, it was a time machine. Standing there in the dim amber light, staring at the dusty label of a 2018 vintage, the present moment began to dissolve. The stone walls melted away, replaced by the blinding, sterile white of a hospital room, and the smell of damp limestone was overpowered by the sharp, stinging scent of antiseptic and latex. It was 2 years ago. The memory did not come to him in a linear fashion. It arrived as a sensory assault, a fragmentation of pain and clarity that he had replayed in his mind 1,000 times. The doctors called it a traumatic brain injury with associated anosmia, the total loss of smell. They explained it to him with sympathetic tilts of their heads, pointing to MRI scans that showed the bruising on his frontal lobes. They spoke of severed nerve fibers, of a life that would now be flavorless and gray. Scott lay in the hospital bed, his head wrapped in bandages, his body broken from the car crash that had nearly killed him. He listened to their diagnosis, but he wasn't looking at the charts. He was looking at the two people standing at the foot of his bed. Laurel was crying. Her tears were copious, streaming down her cheeks in perfect rivulets that didn't seem to ruin her makeup. She held a tissue to her nose, her shoulders shaking with what looked like grief. Next to her stood Grant, his face a mask of stoic devastation, his hand resting protectively on Laurel's shoulder, squeezing it every few seconds. To the doctors, They looked like a loving wife and a supportive best friend, terrified for the man they loved. But Scott knew better. Even through the fog of painkillers and the throbbing headache that felt like a sledgehammer against his skull, he knew. Because the doctors were wrong. He hadn't lost his sense of smell. In that sterile room, Scott could smell the stale coffee on the doctor's breath from 3 feet away. He could smell the metallic tang of the foredrip. But most overpowering of all, he could smell them. He could smell the guilt radiating off Grant like the heat from a sidewalk in summer. A mix of nervous sweat and the scotch he had drunk to steel his nerves before coming to the hospital. And Laurel, underneath the floral notes of her perfume, he smelled the distinctive, musky scent of Grant's aftershave clinging to her blouse. They had come straight from a bed to his deathbed. He watched them. He saw the way Grant's eyes darted to the heart monitor, not with hope, but with calculation. He saw the way Laurel's grief paused for a microsecond when the doctor mentioned the word permanent. There was a flash in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of relief. A terrifying, predatory relief. If Scott couldn't smell, he couldn't work. If he couldn't work, he couldn't run the vineyard. And if he couldn't run the vineyard, they were in charge. That was the moment the Scott Wainwright they knew died. Not in the car crash on Highway 29, but in that hospital bed, when he decided to close his eyes and nod weakly when the doctor asked, "Can you smell this coffee, Mr. Wainwright?" "No," he had whispered, his voice dry as dust. "I smell nothing." He saw Grant's shoulders drop 3 inches. He saw Laurel exhale a breath she had been holding for days. They bought it. They bought the lie because it was the lie they wanted to be true. But the crash hadn't been an accident. Not really. It was the result of a mind unraveling. The memory shifted, pulling him back 48 hours before the hospital to the true moment of impact. It was a Tuesday in late October, the height of the harvest. The air in Napa usually smelled of sugar and yeast during that time, a sweet, heavy fermentation that hung over the valley like a blessing. Scott had been in the tasting room alone, analyzing the barrel samples from the Block 9 harvest, their most prestigious vines. He remembered lifting the glass to his lips. The color was right, a deep, opaque ruby. But the moment he inhaled, his world fractured. The wine was wrong. It wasn't just a bad batch, it was a fraudulent one. The nose promised French oak, but the palate delivered the harsh, vanilla-heavy slap of cheap American wood chips. The structure was flabby, lacking the tannic backbone that defined a Wainwright Cabernet. It tasted like shortcuts. It tasted like greed. Someone had blended their premium grapes with bulk juice from the Central Valley to increase the volume by 20%. It was a move that would generate an extra $2 million in profit, but would destroy the reputation he had spent 20 years building. Only 2 people had the authority to override the winemaking protocols, himself and Grant. Scott had stormed out of the lab, the glass still in his hand, ready to fire Grant on the spot. He had driven to the main estate house, his anger boiling in his veins. He didn't park. He abandoned the car in the driveway and marched toward the study. But as he approached the heavy mahogany doors, he heard voices. "He will notice, Grant. He has the nose of a bloodhound." Laurel's voice came through the wood, sharp and anxious. "He won't notice a thing," Grant's voice replied, dismissive and arrogant. "He is too busy chasing accolades to look at the inventory logs. We swap the barrels, bottle the blend, and ship it to the Asian distributors. By the time they uncork it, we will have cashed the quarterly bonus checks. We need that liquidity, Laurel. Unless you want to sell the house in the Hamptons?" "I am not selling the house," Laurel snapped. Then, her voice softened, turning into a purr that Scott recognized with a sickening lurch of his stomach. "But if he finds out, he will cut us both off. You know how he is about the integrity of the wine." "Screw his integrity," Grant laughed. "He is a dinosaur. We are the ones running this business. We are the ones dealing with the stress while he plays artist in the cellar. Come here. Stop worrying about Scott. He is probably out there swirling a glass and writing poetry about tannins." Then came the silence. A silence filled with the rustle of clothing and the soft, wet sounds of intimacy. Standing in the hallway, Scott felt his reality shatter. It wasn't just the affair. Affairs were common in their social circle, cliched, even. It was the contempt, They didn't just betray his love, they despised him. They mocked his passion, the very thing that paid for the clothes on their backs and the wine in their glasses. They were parasites, feeding on the host while complaining about the taste of the blood. He didn't burst in. He didn't scream. He was too paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disrespect. He turned around and walked out of the house, his legs numb. He got into his car and drove. He drove without a destination, blinded by tears of rage, pushing the speedometer higher and higher, trying to outrun the realization that his entire life was a farce. The slick road, the sharp turn near the cliff edge, the screech of tires, it was inevitable. When the car flipped, crushing metal against rock, Scott didn't feel fear. He felt a strange, detached clarity. As he drifted into unconsciousness, smelling the gasoline and the rain, he made a vow. If he survived, he wouldn't just divorce them. He wouldn't just fire them. That was too easy. That was too clean. He would become the ghost they mocked. He would give them exactly what they wanted. A broken, sensorially deprived husband who was easy to manipulate. He would let them think they had won. He would give them enough rope to hang themselves, loop by loop, day by day. Back in the cellar, the present asserted itself. Scott blinked, the hospital room fading, replaced by the cool darkness of the wine library. The rage from 2 years ago had distilled into something colder, smoother, and infinitely more potent. He looked at his reflection in the glass of a dark cabinet. The scars from the accident were faint now, hidden by his hairline, but the eyes were different. They were the eyes of a predator who had spent 2 years in camouflage. He had watched them. He had watched Grant embezzle funds through shell companies disguised as marketing consultancies. He had watched Laurel slowly isolate him from his friends, telling them he was unstable. He had watched them adulterate the 2023 vintage, and then the 2024. He had let them do it all. Because tonight was the harvest. Tonight, he wouldn't just reveal that he could smell. He would reveal that he had been the one pulling the strings for the last 6 months. The sale to the Chun Group that Laurel was so excited about? Scott had orchestrated it through a proxy. The medical dossier they were about to present? He had swapped the files in the lawyer's briefcase 3 hours ago. Scott reached out and touched the cold stone wall. The flashback was over. The vintage of his pain had finished aging. It was time to serve it. He checked his watch. The presentation was starting in 10 minutes. Grant would be on stage, holding the microphone, feeling like a king. Laurel would be at his side, the grieving queen. Time to go, Scott whispered to the silence. He turned and began the ascent up the stairs, leaving the safety of the cellar behind. His steps were steady, his breathing controlled. As he neared the door that led back to the noise and the light, he paused to adjust his cufflinks. He took a deep breath, inhaling the complex bouquet of the night, expensive cologne, nervous sweat, and the impending destruction of 2 lives. It smelled delicious. The transition from the subterranean silence of the cellar to the grand ballroom was violent. It was not merely a change in location. It was an assault on the senses. As Scott Wainwright pushed through the double doors, the roar of the gala hit him like a physical blow. A cacophony of crystal clinking against crystal, the murmur of 300 voices weaving a tapestry of gossip, and the swelling crescendo of a live orchestra playing a waltz that felt too cheerful for an execution. The air here was stifling, thick with the heat of bodies and the overwhelming, cloying scent of floral arrangements that were trying too hard to mask the smell of ambition. Scott paused at the edge of the room, allowing his eyes to adjust to the brilliance of the crystal chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen explosions. He felt a hand slip into his, the fingers interlocking with his own. It was Laurel. She had materialized beside him, her presence as inevitable as a shadow. Her grip was firm, almost painfully so, a silent command to play his part. To the onlookers, it looked like a gesture of unwavering support, the devoted wife steadying her frail husband. To Scott, it felt like a handcuff. "Just breathe, darling," Laurel whispered, her voice pitched perfectly to be overheard by the couple standing nearest to them. "We are almost there. You are doing so well." She looked up at him with eyes that shimmered with manufactured tears. It was a performance so flawless that Scott almost admired it. She had perfected the role of the martyr, the beautiful, tragic woman burdened by a husband who was no longer whole. Scott did not reply. He simply nodded, a slow, vacant movement that he knew would be interpreted as confusion or fatigue. He let her lead him into the crowd. As they moved through the room, the crowd parted. It was a phenomenon Scott had observed many times before, but tonight it felt different. In the past, people moved aside out of respect, out of a desire to be noticed by the genius of Wainwright Vineyards. Tonight, they moved aside with the awkward reverence one reserves for a funeral procession. The gazes that landed on him were heavy with pity and a morbid curiosity. He could hear the whispers trailing in his wake, snippets of conversation that cut through the music. "He looks terrible," a woman in emerald silk murmured behind her fan. "I heard he does not even know what year it is," her companion replied, swirling his wine. "It is a tragedy, but thank God for Grant. Imagine where the company would be without him." Scott absorbed it all. He kept his face impassive, a blank canvas upon which they could project their own narratives. Inside, however, his mind was razor-sharp. He was cataloging the faces of the board members scattered throughout the room. He saw the chairman of the audit committee, a man who had always claimed to be a stickler for ethics, laughing heartily at a joke Grant had just told. He saw the investors from the Chun Group, standing in a tight circle near the bar, looking at their watches as if waiting for a train. They were all complicit, whether through active malice or passive negligence. Laurel steered him toward the front of the room, near the elevated stage where the main event was about to take place. "Sit here, Scott," she said, guiding him to a velvet chair reserved in the front row. "I need to go up there with Grant for the introduction. You just stay here and try to enjoy the atmosphere." She patted his cheek, two sharp, patronizing taps, and walked away, her scarlet dress trailing behind her like a pool of blood. Scott sat. He placed his hands on his knees and waited. He did not look at the guests who were trying to avoid eye contact with him. He looked at the stage. Grant Holloway was already there. He stood behind the lucite podium, a monolith of modern ambition set against the rustic charm of the barrel-lined walls that served as a backdrop. He looked every inch the captain of industry. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his hair swept back, his smile gleaming under the spotlights. He raised a hand, and the room fell silent. The orchestra faded out, leaving only the hum of anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and friends of the Wainwright family," Grant began, his voice booming with a rich, baritone resonance that commanded authority. "Welcome to the Crimson Harvest. Tonight is a night of celebration. We celebrate the fruit of the earth, the labor of our hands, and the legacy of a name that has defined Napa Valley for 3 generations." He paused for effect, letting the applause wash over him. He looked humble, grateful. "But tonight is also a night of reflection," Grant continued, his tone shifting to one of somber gravity. He looked down at Scott in the front row, his expression softening into a mask of brotherly concern. The spotlight followed his gaze, blinding Scott for a moment. "We all know that the last 2 years have been challenging. We have faced storms, both in the vineyards and in our hearts. My partner, my brother, Scott Wainwright, has faced a battle that few of us can imagine." A collective sigh of sympathy rippled through the room. Handkerchiefs were dabbed at dry eyes. "Scott built this place," Grant said, his voice thickening with emotion. "He poured his soul into every bottle. But even the strongest vines need to rest after a harsh winter. Even the greatest artists must eventually lay down their brushes. It has been my honor, my distinct privilege, to carry the torch while Scott focuses on his recovery. And tonight, we are here to honor that transition. We are here to prove that the Wainwright legacy is bigger than one man. It is a spirit. It is an ideal. And it will continue." He was burying Scott alive. He was eulogizing a man who was sitting 10 feet away. It was a masterclass in corporate assassination. Grant was framing the hostile takeover not as a coup, but as an act of mercy. He was saving the company for Scott, protecting the legacy from Scott. And to mark this new chapter, Grant announced, his energy lifting again, "We have prepared something truly historic. a wine that represents the pinnacle of our past and the promise of our future. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the last drop. The heavy velvet curtains behind him parted. A pedestal rose from the floor, illuminated by a single, focused beam of light. On it sat a bottle. It was magnificent. The glass was dark and ancient-looking, the label etched in gold leaf. It was the legendary cuvee that Scott had purportedly blended just before his accident, the final masterpiece of his career. The crowd gasped. This was the bottle that was expected to fetch over $2 million at the auction later tonight. It was the symbol of the company's value. Laurel walked onto the stage, joining Grant. She looked out at the audience, her face glowing with pride and sadness. She took the microphone. "This wine," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is Scott's heart in a bottle. It contains the very best of him. And although he can no longer appreciate its bouquet, although he can no longer taste the complexity he created, we know that his spirit lives on in every sip you will take tonight." She turned to Scott, extending a hand toward him. "Scott, my love, will you come up here? Will you stand with us one last time as we unveil your masterpiece to the world?" It was the trap, the fatal move. They wanted him on stage. They wanted to display him like a broken artifact next to the shiny new future they were selling. They wanted the contrast to be undeniable, the vibrant, capable Grant and Laurel standing next to the confused, sensory-deprived Scott. They wanted him to stand there while they opened the bottle he supposedly could not smell to prove to the investors that he was truly gone. Scott stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. The room held its breath. He buttoned his jacket. He walked toward the stairs leading to the stage. Every step echoed in the silence. He could feel the vibration of the floorboards. He could smell the anticipation in the room. It smelled like ozone and sweat. He ascended the stairs. Grant stepped back, giving him center stage, a gesture of mock deference. Laurel reached out and took his arm again, her nails digging into his bicep through the fabric of his suit. "Just smile and wave, Scott," she hissed through her teeth, her face beaming at the crowd. "Then we will take you back to your seat." Scott looked at the crowd. He saw the hundreds of faces looking up at him. He looked at Grant, who was watching him with a smug satisfaction. He looked at the bottle on the pedestal. He knew what was in that bottle. He knew because he had smelled the cork from the front row. It was not the 2018 Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon that the label claimed. It was a blend of bulk surplus wine and heavy oak extract, designed to fool the uneducated palates of the investors who bought wine for the status, not the taste. It was a fraud, just like the two people standing next to him. Scott did not wave. He did not smile. He turned to the pedestal. He reached out and picked up the bottle. The glass was cool in his hand. "Grant," Scott said. His voice was not the raspy whisper he had used for 2 years. It was clear. It was steady. It was the voice of the man who had commanded this room 3 years ago. The microphone picked it up and amplified it, sending a shockwave through the hall. Grant blinked, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Scott, you said this is my masterpiece," Scott said, turning the bottle in his hand. "You said this is the pinnacle of the Wainwright legacy." "It is," Laurel interjected quickly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She stepped closer, trying to herd him back. "It is your greatest work, darling. We are all so proud." "Then it is a shame," Scott said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of the front row, "that the cork is compromised." He did not wait for their reaction. With a fluid motion that belied his supposed frailty, Scott reached for the sommelier's knife that lay on the table next to the pedestal. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't fumble. He cut the foil with the precision of a surgeon. "Scott, what are you doing?" Grant stepped forward, his whisper harsh and panicked. "Put that down. You are making a scene." "I am checking the quality, Grant," Scott replied, driving the worm of the corkscrew into the center of the cork. "A winemaker always tastes his vintage before he serves his guests. Unless you have a reason why I should not." He pulled the cork. The sound of the pop echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. Grant froze. Laurel froze. The crowd leaned forward. Scott lifted the cork to his nose. He inhaled deeply. He closed his eyes. The moment hung in the air, suspended in time. He wasn't just smelling the wine. He was smelling the end of their charade. He opened his eyes, and they were cold, clear, and terrifyingly lucid. "Tell me, Grant," Scott said, holding the cork out toward the terrified CEO. "Since when does my masterpiece smell like acetic acid and sawdust?" The ballroom did not gasp. It suspended its breath entirely. The air, previously thick with the hum of polite society, vacuumed into a silence so absolute that the sound of the cork rolling across the polished stage floor sounded like a boulder tumbling down a canyon. Scott Wainwright stood center stage, the dark bottle in one hand, the corkscrew in the other, looking not at the audience, but directly into the eyes of the man who had called himself a brother. Grant Holloway's smile did not vanish, but it ossified. It became a rictus of panic, a frozen geometric shape that no longer conveyed warmth but desperation. He laughed, a hollow, barking sound that echoed uncomfortably through the microphone. "Acetic acid and sawdust," Grant repeated, shaking his head with a pitying chuckle as he turned to the crowd. "You see, this is exactly what the doctors warned us about. The olfactory hallucinations. The phantom smells. It is a tragedy when the mind tries to fill the void of a lost sense with nightmares." Grant reached out, his hand damp and trembling slightly, attempting to take the bottle from Scott. "Come now, Scott. Let us get you off the stage. You are confused. This is the finest wine you ever created. You are just remembering a bad dream." Scott did not relinquish the bottle. He sidestepped Grant's reach with a fluidity that was far too sharp for a man supposedly suffering from advanced neurological decline. He walked over to the tasting table where a row of empty crystal glasses waited. "If I am confused," Scott said, his voice calm, projecting without the aid of the microphone, "then there is no harm in pouring a glass, is there? If this is indeed the nectar of the gods, let us see it. Let us watch it breathe." Laurel Simmons stepped forward. Her mind was racing, calculating the variables at a speed that made her dizzy. She saw the way the investors from the Chun Group were leaning forward, their eyes narrowed. She saw the confusion rippling through the board members. The narrative was slipping. Scott was not acting like the docile invalid she had rehearsed with. He was acting like a prosecutor. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if Scott poured that wine and the audience saw the color, or worse, if he forced someone to taste it, the illusion of the last drop would shatter. And with it, the valuation of the company. She had to stop him. She had to destroy his credibility completely, right now, before the liquid left the bottle. She had to make the fatal move. Laurel reached into the hidden pocket of her crimson gown, a pocket she had requested specifically for this purpose, and withdrew a folded, thick document. It was not a speech. It was a weapon. "Stop," Laurel commanded. Her voice was no longer the soft, grieving whisper of a wife. It was sharp, authoritative, the voice of the woman who had effectively run the company for 2 years. She walked to the microphone, pushing Grant aside. "I am sorry," she said to the crowd, her voice breaking with a perfectly engineered sob. "I did not want to do this. I wanted to protect his dignity. I wanted to protect the memory of the man he used to be. But I cannot let him destroy the legacy of this vineyard because of his delusions." Scott paused. The bottle hovered over the glass. He looked at her. He watched her face contort into a mask of righteous sorrow. He knew exactly what she was holding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Laurel continued, tears streaming down her face now, "Scott is not just suffering from anosmia. The accident, it did more damage than we publicly admitted. He has been diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. He is prone to paranoia, aggression, and severe sensory hallucinations." A murmur of shock swept through the room. This was the nuclear option. She was not just claiming he was physically impaired. She was claiming he was insane. "I have the medical reports here," Laurel said, holding the papers up like a shield. "Signed by 3 independent neurologists. They state clearly that Scott Wainwright is no longer competent to make decisions, legal or financial. They state that he is a danger to the financial stability of this company." She turned to the front row, where the chairman of the board sat, looking pale and uncomfortable. "Chairman Evelyn," Laurel said, her voice stealing. I am formally invoking Article 25 of the Wainwright bylaws. I am presenting you with the certificate of incapacitation. I am asking the board, right now, to transfer full executive control to myself and Grant Holloway as conservators. We cannot let a sick man sabotage the sale that will save this company. We cannot let him pour vinegar and call it wine just because his mind is broken. She walked to the edge of the stage and thrust the papers toward the chairman. The old man hesitated, then reached out and took the dossier. The weight of the paper felt heavy, like a verdict. This was it. The fatal move. Laurel had played her final card. She had publicly declared her husband insane to seize his empire. She had stripped him of his agency, his mind, and his dignity in front of the entire world. She turned back to Scott, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a mixture of triumph and adrenaline. She had done it. She had silenced him. No one would believe a word he said now. Anything he claimed about the wine, about the fraud, about the affair, it would all be dismissed as the rantings of a madman. "Please, Scott," she whispered, stepping closer to him, her back to the audience so only he could see the cold, victorious sneer on her lips. "Put the bottle down. It is over. Go back to your room. We will take care of you." Scott looked at her. He looked at the dossier in the chairman's hands. He looked at Grant, who was wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that cost $500. "Frontotemporal dementia," Scott mused, his voice low. "An interesting diagnosis, Laurel. Especially considering I played chess with Dr. Aris, the head of neurology at St. Helena, just last Tuesday. He seemed to think my cognitive functions were sharp." Laurel's eyes widened. "You are lying," she hissed. "Am I?" Scott asked. He did not put the bottle down. He tilted it. The dark liquid gurgled out of the neck, splashing into the pristine crystal glass. It did not look like the legendary 2021 Cabernet. It was turbid, brown at the edges. It lacked the viscosity, the rich, staining purple tears that defined a great vintage. It poured like water mixed with mud. It poured like a lie. "Look at the color, Laurel," Scott said, his voice rising, carrying over the stunned silence of the room. "Look at the rim variation. That is oxidation. That is the result of a leaking cork. Or perhaps, the result of a barrel that was swapped out for cheap bulk juice and left to rot in a warehouse in Oakland while you laundered the production budget." "He is hallucinating," Grant shouted, lunging forward again. "Don't look at it. It is the lighting. The stage lights are distorting the color." "The nose does not lie," Scott said, lifting the glass. He swirled it violently, agitating the liquid, forcing the volatile compounds into the air. "And neither does the chemistry." He walked to the edge of the stage, bypassing the stairs, and crouched down, extending the glass toward the chairman of the board, the man holding the dossier declaring him insane. "Evelyn," Scott said, his eyes locking with the older man's. "You have been drinking my wine for 30 years. You know the scent of a Wainwright Cabernet. Blackcurrant, cedar, a hint of graphite. Smell this." Laurel lunged. "Don't touch it, Evelyn. He might have spiked it. He is unstable." But it was too late. The smell was already wafting off the glass. It was pungent, acrid. It smelled of vinegar, nail polish remover, and wet cardboard. It was unmistakable. It was not the smell of a $2 million bottle. It was the smell of negligence and fraud. Evelyn recoiled, his nose wrinkling instinctively. He looked up at Scott, then down at the dossier in his hand, and then back at the glass. The cognitive dissonance was breaking. A man with dementia might imagine smells, but he could not hallucinate the physical stench wafting into the nostrils of another man. It smells like vinegar," Evelyn whispered, his voice caught by the microphone near the stage. The crowd heard it. The whisper was louder than a scream. Scott stood up, towering over the stage. He turned back to Laurel and Grant. They were shrinking. The spotlight that had been their ally was now an interrogation lamp. "You invoked Article 25, Scott said, his voice cold and hard as the stone of his cellar. "You presented a medical dossier based on forgeries and bribes. You tried to bury me before I was dead. But you forgot the first rule of winemaking, Laurel." He took a step toward her. She took a step back, her heel catching on the hem of her dress. "You cannot mask the taint," Scott said. Once the rod is in the barrel, it ruins the whole batch. And this company, this board, has been drinking your rot for 2 years. Scott reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo. He did not pull out a speech. He did not pull out a tissue. He pulled out a small, sleek, black remote control. You wanted to show the board some documents, Scott said. I think that is a fair idea. But let us look at the real documentation. Let us look at the accounting. Let us look at the surveillance logs. He pointed the remote at the massive projection screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the elegant logo of the last drop. Grant, Scott said, his finger hovering over the button. Laurel, you might want to sit down. This part of the evening is going to be full-bodied. The screen flickered, the logo vanished, and the banquet of judgment truly began. The screen behind the stage flickered, a sudden burst of harsh, blue light that cut through the warm, golden ambience of the ballroom like a scalpel. The logo of the last drop, the elegant, gold-leaf calligraphy that had promised a legacy, dissolved into static before sharpening into a high-resolution image that made the breath catch in the throats of 300 guests. It was not a graph of projected earnings, nor was it a promotional montage of sun-drenched vineyards. It was a scanned document, magnified to the size of a billboard. The header was unmistakable, a bank transfer authorization from the corporate accounts of Wainwright Vineyards to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands named Veritas Consulting. The amount was staggering, 7 figures, siphoned off just 3 days prior. Scott stood motionless at the edge of the stage, the remote control resting lightly in his palm. He did not look at the screen. He knew every pixel of that image. He had spent nights tracking the digital breadcrumbs, following the money through a labyrinth of dummy corporations and offshore havens. Instead, he watched the audience. He watched the way the confusion on their faces hardened into realization. He watched the chairman of the board, Evelyn, squint at the screen, his lips moving silently as he read the names authorized on the transfer, Grant Holloway and Laurel Simmons. The silence that followed was different from the one before. The previous silence had been one of shock. This was the silence of judgment. It was the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a courtroom just before the gavel falls. Technical difficulties, Grant stammered, his voice cracking over the microphone. He lunged toward the AV console at the side of the stage, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Cut the feed. Someone cut the feed. This is a hack. We are being cyber-attacked. Let it play, Scott said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that froze the sound technician's hand over the control board. Scott turned to Grant. There is no hacker, Grant. There is only the ledger. And as you always told me, the numbers do not lie. Grant froze, his hand halfway to the tech, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. He turned back to the audience, a desperate, sweating smile plastered on his face. Ladies and gentlemen, please. This is absurd. Scott is. He is unwell. He has access to Photoshop. He is trying to frame us because of his paranoia. He is jealous that we saved the company while he was. Scott pressed the button again. The image on the screen changed. The bank statement vanished, replaced by a grainy, black and white video feed. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was recorded 2 months ago. The setting was familiar to everyone in the room. It was the executive office of Wainwright Vineyards, a space of mahogany and leather that exuded power. In the frame, Laurel was sitting on the edge of Scott's desk, a glass of wine in her hand. Grant was pacing in front of her. The audio crackled through the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system, clear and damning. He is never going to wake up, is he? Grant's voice from the recording echoed, tinny but unmistakable. He is awake, Grant, but he is not there, Laurel's recorded voice replied, dripping with a cold, casual cruelty. The doctors say the anosmia is the least of it. He is depressed, lethargic. He trusts me completely. I put the papers in front of him, and he signs them without reading. It is like taking candy from a baby. On the screen, Grant laughed. A baby with $100 million trust fund. God, how much longer do we have to play nursemaid? The Chin Group wants to close by the harvest. Patience, Laurel said, taking a sip of wine. Let him humiliate himself at the gala. Let him stand there like a broken doll. Once the board sees he is incompetent, we trigger the incapacity clause, sell the land, and we are in Zurich by Christmas. The video froze on Laurel's face, captured in a moment of arrogant triumph. In the ballroom, the reality of the betrayal settled like sediment in a bottle. The guests, who minutes ago had been dabbing their eyes at Laurel's performance of the grieving wife, now looked at her with a mixture of horror and revulsion. The veneer of high society, of politeness and decorum, shattered. A low murmur of outrage began to build, a rumbling wave that started in the back rows and surged toward the stage. Laurel Simmons stood center stage, stripped naked in the eyes of the world. She did not move. She could not. The projection of her own face behind her, 10 feet tall and sneering, mocked the woman standing in the scarlet dress. Her hands trembled violently at her sides. She looked at the audience, seeking a friendly face, an ally, someone who would stand up and scream that it was a fake. But she found only cold, hard stares. The last drop had been spilled, and the stain was spreading. Scott watched her. He felt a strange, detached pity. Not for her, but for the waste of it all. She had been brilliant, in her own way. Sharp, charismatic, driven. If she had applied that energy to the vineyard instead of the theft, they could have built an empire that lasted a century. Instead, she had chosen the quick harvest, the rot. "You said I was a broken doll," Scott said, addressing the room but looking only at her. "You said I was a vegetable. You were banking on my silence. You thought that because I did not speak, I did not see. You thought that because I did not fight, I did not know." He took a step closer to her, invading her personal space. The scent of her panic was acrid, overpowering the expensive jasmine perfume she wore. It smelled of adrenaline and sour sweat. "I have been awake, Laurel," Scott whispered, low enough that the microphone barely caught it, intimate and terrifying. "I have been awake every single day. I read every document you slipped under my nose. I tracked every bottle of adulterated swill you shipped to Asia. I recorded every conversation you had in my office, in my kitchen, in my cellar. You didn't just steal my money. You stole my name. You poisoned my reputation." Laurel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Grant, but Grant was already backing away, his eyes darting toward the exit signs, the fight draining out of him as self-preservation kicked in. It was her idea. Grant shouted suddenly, his voice shrill. He pointed a shaking finger at Laurel. "She planned it. She told me you were finished, Scott. She told me the company was going under. I was just trying to save it. I just followed her lead." The crowd gasped again. The rats were turning on each other. Laurel whipped her head around, staring at Grant in disbelief. The betrayal she had inflicted on Scott was now being reflected back at her, magnified. "You coward," she hissed, her voice returning in a screech. "You spineless worm. You were the one who suggested the offshore accounts. You were the one who mixed the bulk juice." "I have the emails," Grant yelled, backing up until he hit the drum set of the orchestra, the cymbals crashing behind him like a discordant punchline. "I kept everything. She manipulated me, Scott. I am your friend. I was a victim of her manipulation too." Scott watched them tear at each other. It was a pathetic display, a farce of loyalty dissolving the moment the pressure was applied. He felt a profound weariness. This was the vengeance he had planned, the moment he had curated for 2 years, yet it brought him no joy. It only confirmed the bleak hypothesis he had formed in the hospital bed, that everyone had a price, and loyalty was just a commodity to be sold when the market was right. He raised the remote again. The bickering on stage ceased instantly. They both looked at him, terrified of what might come next. "I have enough evidence on this drive," Scott said, tapping the remote against his palm, "to send you both to federal prison for 20 years. Fraud, embezzlement, corporate espionage, and—" He paused, his eyes hardening. "Conspiracy to commit bodily harm. Because we both know the brake lines on my car didn't cut themselves 2 years ago, didn't they, Grant?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This was new information. The audience went deathly silent. This wasn't just white-collar crime anymore. This was attempted murder. Grant's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He opened his mouth to deny it, but his knees gave way. He slumped against the percussion stand, looking small and broken. Scott turned to the chairman of the board, who had risen from his seat, his face red with fury. "Evelyn," Scott said calmly, "I believe you have some calls to make. The authorities are waiting in the lobby. I invited them as my guests for the evening. I thought they might appreciate the entertainment." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't wait for the police to storm the room. He didn't wait for the applause or the apologies that he knew would come from the fickle crowd. Scott Wainwright had finished his presentation. The vintage was served. The tasting was over. He turned his back on the stage, on the weeping wife and the cowering friend, and walked toward the stairs. He descended with the same slow, deliberate pace he had used to enter. The crowd parted for him again, but this time there was no pity. There was fear. There was awe. They looked at him as if he were a mythical creature who had returned from the dead to burn the village down. As he reached the floor, he stopped. He looked at the glass of the last drop that still sat on the edge of the stage, the brown, oxidized liquid catching the light. "One more thing," Scott said, not turning around. "The real 2021 vintage, the one I actually made, is safe. It is resting in a vault in Bordeaux. It will be ready in 10 years. You are all welcome to taste it then. Assuming, of course, that this company still has a soul by then." He walked out of the ballroom, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him, cutting off the noise of the eruption that was just beginning to consume the room. He walked into the cool, quiet hallway alone. But for the first time in 2 years, the silence didn't feel like a prison. It felt like freedom. The library of the Wainwright estate was a sanctuary of shadow and mahogany, a stark contrast to the blinding brilliance of the ballroom. Here, the air did not smell of desperate perfume and treachery. It smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and the faint, comforting aroma of wood smoke from the dying embers in the hearth. Scott Wainwright stood by the window, looking out at the vineyards that stretched like black velvet into the night. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers strobing against the ancient vines looked alien, a violent intrusion of the modern world into a landscape that had remained unchanged for a century. He took a sip from the glass in his hand. It was not wine. It was a 50-year-old Armagnac, burning and clean, a spirit distilled to purge the palate of the sour taste that had coated his tongue for 2 years. Behind him, the heavy double doors opened. He did not turn. He knew who it was by the cadence of the footsteps, the heavy, authoritative tread of Detective Miller, followed by the shuffling, uneven steps of those who had lost control of their own destiny. "Mr. Wainwright," Miller's voice was respectful, low. "We have them. They are being processed for transport, but..." "Well," she insisted. She said she wouldn't step into the car until she looked you in the eye. "I can remove them if you prefer." Scott turned slowly. The room was dimly lit, cast in the flickering orange glow of the fireplace. Standing near the entrance, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, were Laurel and Grant. The transformation was grotesque. An hour ago, they had been the golden couple of Napa Valley, radiating power and invincible arrogance. Now, Laurel's makeup was smeared, her scarlet dress crumpled, the straps sliding off her shoulder in a caricature of disarray. Grant looked even worse. The starch had gone out of him completely, leaving a man who seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive tuxedo, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rodent. "Leave them for a moment," Scott said, placing his glass on the mantel. "Thank you, Detective." Miller nodded and stepped back, though he remained alert, his hand resting casually near his belt. The door clicked shut, sealing the 3 of them in the room that had once been the heart of their shared life. "Scott," Laurel began, her voice trembling. It was a sound Scott recognized. It was the tone she used when she wanted to negotiate a lower price with a supplier, a mix of vulnerability and calculation. You can't let them take us. This is madness. Prison? For family?" "Family," Scott repeated the word, tasting it. It felt like ash. "That is a word you forfeited a long time ago, Laurel. Around the time you started sleeping with my best friend. Or perhaps it was when you authorized the brake line sabotage. I am still debating which betrayal was the definitive one." "It was just money, Scott," Grant blurted out, stepping forward before the officer's hand restrained him. We can pay it back. The transfer. The account in the Caymans. We haven't touched it yet. We can reverse it. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them it was a stress test for the security systems. We can fix this. Scott looked at Grant with a gaze so devoid of emotion, it was terrifying. He walked over to his desk, a massive slab of oak that had belonged to his grandfather. On it sat a single, thick manila envelope. The true dossier. You think this is about the money, Grant? Scott asked softly. You think I staged this entire evening, endured 2 years of humiliation, and invited the FBI to my harvest gala just to recover $7 million? I make $7 million in a good quarter. He picked up the envelope. You still don't understand the vintage I have been brewing, do you? You think you were stealing from me. You think you were the clever fox in the henhouse. But you weren't stealing, Grant. You were harvesting exactly what I planted for you. Scott tossed the envelope onto the desk. It slid across the polished wood and came to rest in front of Laurel. Open it, Scott commanded. Laurel hesitated, her handcuffed hands fumbling awkwardly. She tore the seal. Inside were not bank statements or legal briefs. They were photographs, transcripts. She pulled out the first sheet. It was a printout of a chat log. Her eyes scanned the lines, and her face, already pale, turned the color of chalk. She looked up at Grant, then back at the paper. What is this? She whispered. That, Scott said, leaning against the desk, crossing his arms, is the record of Grant's communication with the federal authorities. Dated 6 months ago. Grant let out a strangled noise, a sound of pure terror. Laurel whipped her head around to stare at him. You see, Laurel, Scott continued, his voice smooth and surgical, Grant isn't just a thief. He is a coward. When I first started tightening the net around the accounting discrepancies last spring, subtly, of course, Grant got nervous. He sensed something was wrong. So he did what rats do. He looked for a lifeboat. You talked to the feds? Laurel screamed at Grant, her voice cracking. 6 months ago? We were planning the wedding in Como 6 months ago. I didn't. Grant stammered, sweat pouring down his face. They squeezed me, Laurel. I thought if I gave them something, they would go easy on me. He offered them a deal, Scott clarified, enjoying the look of absolute horror dawning on Laurel's face. He offered to testify against you. He painted you as the mastermind, the Lady Macbeth who seduced him and forced him to cook the books. He told them everything. The forgery, the embezzlement, the medical fraud. He was ready to send you to prison for 20 years to save his own skin. Laurel stared at the man she had destroyed her marriage for, the man she had ridiculed Scott with, the man she thought was her partner in crime. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't the player, she was the pawn. But here is the twist, Scott said, pointing to the second document in Laurel's hands. Grant didn't know that I was the one feeding the authorities the information to pressure him. I needed him to turn on you. I needed the conspiracy to shatter from the inside. And he made it so easy. Grant sank to his knees, sobbing. It was a pathetic, ugly sound. But that is not the only thing in the dossier, Laurel, Scott said, his voice dropping to a lower, darker register. Keep looking. There is one more page. The final vintage. Laurel, her hands shaking so hard the papers rattled, pulled out the last photograph. It was a grainy surveillance shot, taken from a hotel balcony in San Francisco. It showed Grant. He was not alone. He was kissing a woman. But it wasn't Laurel. It was a woman with dark hair, laughing, holding a glass of wine. Laurel gasped, a sound of pure, agonizing recognition. Sarah? Your sister, Scott confirmed. Your baby sister. The one you trust with your secrets. The one you told about the offshore accounts just in case something happened to you. Grant has been sleeping with her for the last 8 months. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a soul breaking. Laurel looked at the photo, then at Grant, who was now curled on the floor, unable to even look at her. You. Laurel couldn't even finish the sentence. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just financial. It wasn't just legal. It was personal, intimate, and devastatingly complete. She had thrown away a husband who worshipped her, a fortune, and her reputation. All for a man who was selling her out to the police with one hand and sleeping with her sister with the other. Why? Laurel whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. Scott pushed off the desk and walked toward her. He stopped inches away, looking down at the woman he had once vowed to protect with his life. He felt nothing. No love. No hate. Just the cold clarity of a finished job. Because he is like the wine you tried to sell tonight, Laurel, Scott said. Cheap, acidic, and lacking any real character. You just didn't have the nose to smell it. He turned to Detective Miller. Get them out of my house. Laurel didn't fight as the officer took her arm. She didn't scream. She looked like a sleepwalker, her eyes dead, fixed on the floor. Grant was hauled up, weeping, his legs dragging as they pulled him out. The door closed, cutting off the sounds of their destruction. Scott was alone again. He walked back to the window. The blue lights were still flashing, but soon they would fade, taking the rot away with them. He picked up his glass of Armagnac. He swirled it, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. The dossier was closed. The account was settled. He had stripped them of everything. Their money, their freedom, and worst of all, their illusions about each other. He had let them judge him, let them mock him, all while he held the mirror that would eventually show them their own ugly reflections. He took a sip. It was warm, complex, with notes of dried fruit and smoke. It was real. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The rebranding. The explanation to the shareholders. The rebuilding of the trust he had allowed to erode for the sake of the trap. It would be exhausting. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, the air in the house was clean. Scott finished the drink and set the glass down. He looked at the empty chair where his father used to sit. The weeds are gone, Scott whispered to the ghosts of the vineyard. Now we grow. The blue and red strobes of the police cruisers faded into the distance, swallowed by the winding darkness of the Silverado Trail. But the atmosphere inside the grand ballroom remained electric, charged with the static of scandal. The departure of Laurel Simmons and Grant Holloway had sucked the oxygen out of the room, leaving behind a vacuum that was rapidly filling with the frantic, hushed murmurs of 300 socialites. The gala, once a choreographed display of wealth and prestige, had dissolved into the chaotic aftermath of a public execution. Waiters stood frozen with trays of melting ice, unsure whether to continue serving or to flee. The orchestra had stopped playing, the musicians packing away their instruments with the hurried, averted gazes of people who had witnessed something they wished they hadn't. Scott Wainwright did not immediately return to the spotlight. He stood in the shadows of the archway leading from the library, observing the wreckage of the evening. From this vantage point, the crowd looked less like distinguished guests and more like a colony of ants whose hill had been kicked over. He watched them scrolling frantically through their phones, undoubtedly deleting selfies taken with Laurel earlier in the evening, scrubbing their social media feeds of any association with the woman who was now in handcuffs. It was a masterclass in survival instinct. In the world of high society, contamination was feared more than bankruptcy. He adjusted his cufflinks, the cool metal grounding him, and stepped back into the room. His reentry was not announced, but it was felt. A ripple of silence spread outward from the doorway, silencing the whispers as he moved. The guests, who had looked at him with pity only an hour ago, now parted with a mixture of awe and terrified respect. They saw the man who had played the long game, the man who had turned his own humiliation into a weapon. They saw the predator, not the prey. Evelyn, the chairman of the board, was the first to break the cordon. The older man looked as though he had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held a glass of water that he couldn't seem to bring to his lips. He intercepted Scott near the center of the room, his posture stooped in contrition. "Scott," Evelyn began, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat, trying to summon the authority he had lost. "Scott, we had no idea. The documents she presented, the doctor's reports, they looked authentic. We were trying to protect the company. You have to understand that." Scott stopped. He looked down at the chairman, a man who had known his father, a man who had bounced Scott on his knee as a child. The betrayal of the board had not been one of malice, perhaps, but of negligence. They had chosen the easy path, The path of least resistance offered by the charming wife and the energetic CEO. They had failed to ask the hard questions because the answers might have been inconvenient. You were protecting the stock price, Evelyn, not the company, Scott said, his voice calm but laced with a bitterness that cut through the ambient noise. There is a difference. A company is its people, its soil, its integrity. The stock price is just a number that lets you sleep at night in your gated communities. We will convene an emergency meeting in the morning, Evelyn stammered, desperate to bridge the gap. We will formally reinstate you. We will launch a full internal audit. We will make this right. The audit is already done, Scott replied, brushing a speck of imaginary dust from his lapel. I hired a forensic accounting firm 6 months ago. The report is on your desk. As for the reinstatement, do not bother. I never left. I just stopped correcting your mistakes. He walked past Evelyn, leaving the chairman standing in the wake of his dismissal. Scott moved toward the stage, where the bottle of the fraudulent last drop still sat on the pedestal, uncorked and accusing. The smell of the spoiled wine was faint now, overwhelmed by the scent of fear in the room, but Scott could still detect the ascetic tang. It was the scent of his own blindness, the scent of the years he had let them get away with it. He climbed the stairs to the stage. The room fell deathly silent again. They were waiting for a speech, for a reassurance that everything would go back to normal, that the uncomfortable reality of the night would be swept under the rug. Scott picked up the bottle. He looked at the label, the gold leaf glinting under the stage lights. It was a beautiful lie. This bottle, Scott spoke without a microphone, his voice projecting effortlessly to the back of the room, is not for sale. In fact, nothing from the last 2 vintages is for sale. A gasp went through the investors from the Chun Group, who were huddled near the exit. They had been ready to sign a check for millions. This vineyard has been sick, Scott continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. It was infected with a rot that started in the executive offices and spread to the barrels. You all tasted it, and you said nothing. You drank the vinegar and called it ambrosia because it was served in crystal. He walked to the edge of the stage and tipped the bottle. The dark, brownish liquid poured out in a steady stream, splashing onto the polished floorboards, staining the wood like old blood. He didn't stop until the bottle was empty. We are starting over, Scott announced, setting the empty bottle down with a final, hollow thud. Tomorrow, the bulldozers arrive. We are tearing out Block 4, the vines Laurel planted. We are draining the tanks containing the adulterated blends. We are burning the barrels that Grant ordered. We are going to bleed this place dry until only the truth remains. He looked at the staff standing by the service entrance, the cellar hands, the vineyard manager, the old secretary who had been weeping silently during the arrest. These were the people who had kept their heads down, who had whispered warnings that Scott had been too proud to hear 3 years ago, and too incapacitated to acknowledge for the last 2. To the staff, Scott said, his tone softening for the first time. If you were complicit, if you took a payout to look the other way, do not come in tomorrow. Your final checks will be mailed. But for those of you who stayed, for those of you who tried to maintain standards while your bosses were looting the place, I know who you are. And tomorrow, we build a vineyard you can be proud of again. He turned his back on the audience. He had no desire to mingle, to accept their hollow apologies or their fawning congratulations. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen. He descended the back stairs of the stage and exited through the service corridor, leaving the chaos of the ballroom behind. The transition was sharp. The corridor was cool, smelling of concrete and cleaning supplies, an honest smell. He walked past the kitchen, where the chefs were frozen in the middle of plating desserts that would never be eaten. He pushed through the rear exit and stepped out into the night air. The vineyard was quiet. The moon hung high over the Mayacamas Mountains, casting a silver sheen over the rows of grapevines that stretched endlessly into the dark. The air here was clean, crisp, and alive. It smelled of damp earth, of photosynthesis, of the deep, slumbering roots that reached down into the volcanic soil. This was the only reality that mattered. Scott loosened his tie, unbuttoning the collar of his shirt. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the night. For 2 years, he had suffocated under the weight of the mask. He had played the fool, the invalid, the ghost. He had let them strip him of his dignity to save his legacy. Now, the mask was gone, but the face underneath felt different. It was harder, weathered. He heard the crunch of gravel behind him. He didn't turn. He knew the scent: unscented soap, gun oil, and cheap coffee. "They are in custody, Mr. Wainwright," Detective Miller said, stepping up beside him. "The district attorney is already asking for a meeting. With the evidence you provided, they are looking at conspiracy, grand larceny, and attempted murder. They won't be seeing daylight for a very long time." "Good," Scott said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "There is one thing, though." Miller hesitated. "Laurel. She asked for a message to be passed to you. She said she only did it because she felt you didn't see her anymore, that you loved the vines more than her." Scott laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound that rustled like dead leaves. "She is still rewriting history, even in the back of a squad car. I saw her, Detective. I saw her too clearly. That was the problem. I saw a woman who looked at a sunset and calculated the real estate value. I saw a woman who drank wine not to taste it, but to get drunk. She wanted to be worshipped, not loved. And vines repay your love with fruit. Laurel repaid it with poison." Miller nodded, understanding that the conversation was over. "We will need a formal statement in the morning." "You will have it," Scott said. The detective walked away, his footsteps fading into the dark. Scott remained alone. He walked over to the nearest vine, an old Cabernet stock that was gnarled and thick. He reached out and touched the rough bark. He could feel the vibration of life inside it. It had survived droughts, fires, and pests. It had survived neglect. It would survive this. He was tired. His bones ached with the exhaustion of a man who had held his breath for 700 days. But as he stood there, surrounded by the silence of the valley, he felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't happiness. That was a luxury for people who hadn't been betrayed by everyone they loved. It was something more durable. It was peace. The purge was complete. The sour turn was over. The fermentation of a new life could finally begin. Scott turned back toward the house, where the lights were still blazing, casting long shadows across the lawn. He had a company to rebuild, a reputation to salvage, and a harvest to plan. But for tonight, he would go to his cellar, find a bottle that had never been touched by Grant or Laurel, and he would drink it in silence. 3 months had passed since the Crimson Harvest Gala, time enough for the seasons to turn in the Napa Valley. The lush, verdant canopy that had hidden the rot of the vineyard had been stripped away by the autumn winds, leaving the vines bare, skeletal, and honest against the steel-gray sky of December. It was the season of dormancy, a necessary sleep before the rebirth of spring, and Scott Wainwright found a strange comfort in the stark, unadorned landscape. The earth was resting. The wounds in the soil where the tainted block had been uprooted were beginning to heal, covered now by a cover crop of mustard and clover. But 3 hours south, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit sphere of the federal courthouse in San Francisco, there was no such peace. The air here did not smell of wet earth and promise. It smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and the distinct, metallic perspiration of people realizing their lives were over. Scott sat in the back row of courtroom 4B. He had not been subpoenaed to appear today. His testimony had been given weeks ago in a deposition that lasted 3 days and decimated the defense's case. But he felt compelled to witness the conclusion. It was the final step in the vinification process, the bottling. You do not leave a vintage in the barrel forever. Eventually, you must seal it, label it, and put it away in the dark. When the bailiff announced the arrival of the defendants, the room shifted. A heavy, suffocating silence descended, broken only by the jingle of chains. It was a sound that seemed jarringly out of place on the people who walked through the side door. Laurel Simmons entered first. The transformation was not just physical, it was existential. The woman who had glided through the gala in a custom scarlet gown was gone. In her place was a figure in a drab, ill-fitting jumpsuit that hung loosely on a frame that had grown gaunt. Her hair, once a blinding platinum halo, was pulled back into a severe, messy bun, the dark roots showing 3 inches of growth, a visible calendar of her incarceration. But it was her face that held Scott's attention. The mask of the Queen of the Valley had not just cracked, it had dissolved. Her skin was sallow, deprived of the expensive creams and treatments she had billed to the company account. But her eyes were the true ruins. They were dull, vacant, staring at the floor with the dissociation of someone who cannot reconcile their reality with their self-image. Grant Holloway followed. If Laurel looked broken, Grant looked consumed. He had lost weight, but in a nervous, frantic way. His eyes darted around the courtroom, scanning the gallery, the judge, the exit signs, searching for a deal that wasn't there, for a loophole he hadn't yet exploited. When his gaze landed on Scott in the back row, he flinched physically, as if he had been struck, and quickly looked away. They sat at separate tables, flanked by public defenders who looked weary before the proceedings even began. The high-priced legal team they had initially retained had resigned weeks ago when the assets were frozen and the checks bounced. The physical distance between Laurel and Grant was only 10 feet, but the emotional chasm was infinite. They did not look at each other. The hatred radiating between them was palpable, a toxic heat that seemed to shimmer in the air. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Vane, was a woman known for her patience and her severity in white-collar crime cases. She shuffled the thick stack of files on her bench, the sound amplified by the microphone. "We are here for sentencing in the matter of the United States versus Laurel Simmons and Grant Holloway," Judge Vane said, her voice dry and devoid of theatrics. "Both defendants have entered guilty pleas to charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and in the case of Mr. Holloway, accessory to attempted bodily harm. The court has reviewed the pre-sentencing reports." She looked over her reading glasses at the 2 figures before her. "I have sat on this bench for 20 years, the judge continued, her tone conversational but cutting. "I have seen greed in many forms. I have seen desperation. But rarely have I seen such a calculated, systematic dismantling of a person's life and livelihood by the very people claiming to love him. You did not just steal money. You attempted to steal a man's reality. You gaslit a husband and a friend into believing he was insane, all while you lived in the luxury his talent provided." Laurel flinched. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear leaking out. It wasn't a performance this time. It was the stinging clarity of the truth spoken aloud. "Mr. Holloway," the judge turned her gaze to Grant, "your attorney has argued for leniency based on your cooperation. You provided the evidence regarding the brake line tampering. You testified against Ms. Simmons regarding the offshore accounts." Grant nodded vigorously, a pathetic hope lighting up his face. "Yes, Your Honor. I tried to make it right." "You only tried to make it right when the handcuffs were inevitable," Judge Vane corrected him sharply. "You turned on your co-conspirator to save yourself. That is not remorse, Mr. Holloway. That is survival instinct. And it is consistent with the character you showed when you betrayed your best friend." She turned to Laurel. "And you, Miss Simmons. You were the architect. The court has read the transcripts of your conversations. The callousness with which you discussed your husband's mental decline while planning your life in Europe is chilling. You were not a victim of Mr. Holloway's influence. You were the driving force." Laurel didn't speak. She couldn't. The revelation of Grant's affair with her sister Sarah, the photos Scott had revealed in the library, had done more damage to her than any prison sentence could. She had been the manipulator, yes, but she had also been the fool. She had destroyed her marriage for a man who was laughing at her behind her back with her own flesh and blood. The irony was a poison she swallowed every morning in her cell. "Please stand," the judge commanded. They stood. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoed like gunshots. "Grant Holloway, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, with a mandatory minimum of 12 years before eligibility for parole. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $4 million. Grant's knees buckled. He grabbed the table for support, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. 15 years. He would be 55 when he got out. His life, the golden trajectory he had felt entitled to, was incinerated. Laurel Simmons, the judge continued, her eyes hardening. For the orchestration of the fraud, the psychological abuse, and the financial devastation of the Wainwright estate, I sentence you to 18 years in federal prison. Laurel didn't move. She didn't scream. She simply exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the last of her vanity out of her body. 18 years. She would be an old woman. The beauty she had weaponized, the youth she had prized above all else, would rot away in a concrete box. This court is adjourned. Judge Vane banged the gavel. The sound was final. It was the cork being driven home. The bailiffs moved in immediately. There were no tearful goodbyes. There was no family in the gallery to wave to them. Laurel's sister Sarah had fled to France the day the news broke, cutting all contact. They were alone. As they were let out, Grant turned his head one last time. He looked at Scott. His eyes were wide, pleading, perhaps expecting some last-minute intervention, some mercy from the friend he had known since college. Scott met his gaze. He did not smile. He did not frown. He looked at Grant with the dispassionate clinical interest of a winemaker inspecting a barrel that had turned to vinegar. There was nothing to save. There was nothing to blend. It was just waste. Grant looked away, defeated, and disappeared through the side door. Laurel followed, her head bowed, refusing to look at the man she had married. She knew that if she looked at Scott, she would see the reflection of what she had thrown away, and that was a torment she could not endure. The room emptied. The buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder. Scott remained seated for a moment, letting the silence settle. He felt light. The heavy coat of anger he had worn for 2 years, the suffocating weight of the performance, was gone. He stood up and buttoned his jacket. He walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Outside, the San Francisco fog was rolling in, cool and damp. It wrapped around the buildings, softening the hard edges of the city. Scott walked down the courthouse steps, taking a deep breath of the briny air. It wasn't the sweet air of the valley, but it was clean. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was a message from his new vineyard manager, a young, brilliant viticulturist named Elena who had a reverence for the soil that reminded Scott of his younger self. Message: soil pH analysis for Block 4 came back. It's balanced. We can start replanting in the spring. What clone do you want to use? Scott looked at the screen. He looked at the gray sky. He thought about the empty spaces in his life, the silence in the big house, the ghost of the marriage that had just been legally declared dead. He thought about the 18 years Laurel would spend staring at a wall, and the 15 years Grant would spend looking over his shoulder. They had been judged. They had been sentenced. But the real verdict wasn't the years in prison. The real verdict was that Scott Wainwright was still standing. He still had his nose. He still had his hands. And he still had the land. He typed a reply. Response: use the heritage clone. It has deep roots. It survives anything. He put the phone away and walked toward his car. The city noise faded into the background as his mind drifted north, back to the quiet rows of vines sleeping in the winter cold. The drama was over. The story of the billionaire and the cheating wife was finished, filed away in the archives of gossip. Now, there was only the wine. And the wine, Scott knew, would be better for the struggle. The best vintages always were. Spring had arrived in the Napa Valley with a violence of color that seemed to mock the gray austerity of the winter that had passed. The dormant vines, which had stood like twisted iron skeletons against the cold rains of January, were now bursting with life. Bud break had begun, the most critical moment in the cycle of the vineyard, when the tiny, fuzzy green nodes pushed through the rough bark, signaling the start of a new vintage. Between the rows, the wild mustard flowers bloomed in an explosion of vibrant yellow, creating a carpet of gold that stretched all the way to the foothills of the Mayacamas Mountains. Scott Wainwright stood knee-deep in this sea of yellow and green. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He was not holding a crystal flute. He wore heavy denim work trousers, stained with the clay-rich loam of the valley, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hands, once manicured for boardrooms and galas, were rough again, etched with the dirt that was the true source of his wealth. He was kneeling at the edge of Block 4. This was the acreage where Laurel had ordered the planting of high-yield, low-quality clones to maximize profit, the vines that had produced the watery, soulless fruit he had poured onto the stage floor 3 months ago. Those vines were gone now. The earth had been tilled, aerated, and purged. In their place, Scott was overseeing the planting of the heritage clone, an ancient, low-yielding varietal that produced small, concentrated berries with thick skins and complex souls. "The rootstock is taking well," a voice said behind him. Scott stood up, brushing the soil from his knees. Elena, his new vineyard manager, stood there holding a clipboard. She was young, barely 30, with sun-weathered skin and hands that looked like they could wrestle a tractor. She did not look at him with the fawning adoration of the socialites, nor the duplicitous charm of Grant. She looked at him with the pragmatic respect of one farmer to another. "The soil analysis was correct," Scott replied, looking down at the young graft. "The trauma to the land actually improved the mineral uptake. It is strange how that works. Sometimes you have to tear everything out to get the nutrients moving again. It is the same with people, I suppose," Elena said, her tone casual, checking a box on her sheet. "The truck is here with the barrels from the cooperage in France. The ones you ordered. Medium toast, tighter grain. No shortcuts." "Good," Scott said. "Have them unloaded in the main cellar. I will inspect them personally in an hour." Elena nodded and walked away, her boots crunching on the gravel. Scott watched her go. It was a simple interaction, devoid of subtext, devoid of manipulation. It was clean. For 2 years, every conversation he had held had been a minefield of double meanings and coded lies. Now he could speak plainly. He could say what he meant, and he could trust that the person listening was hearing him, not calculating his net worth. Scott turned and began the long walk back toward the main house. The estate rose up on the hill, a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa that had been in his family for 3 generations. For a long time, looking at it had filled him with a sense of dread. It had been Laurel's stage, her dollhouse where she rearranged the furniture and the people to suit her aesthetic. She had filled it with white lilies, a flower Scott hated because they smelled of funerals, and modern art that cost a fortune but meant nothing. But today, the windows were open. The white lilies were gone, replaced by simple arrangements of wildflowers from the property. The heavy, velvet drapes that Laurel had installed to keep out the sun had been taken down, allowing the late afternoon light to flood the rooms, chasing away the shadows where secrets used to hide. He walked into the kitchen. It was silent. The staff of 20 that Laurel had insisted upon, the personal chefs, the assistants, the stylists, was gone. He had kept only the housekeeper, Maria, who had been with his parents, and a small, essential team. The house felt bigger, yes, but it also felt lighter. It no longer felt like a museum or a prison. It felt like a home that was waiting to be lived in. Scott went to the wine fridge in the pantry. He bypassed the expensive labels, the trophy wines that Grant had collected to impress investors. He reached for a simple bottle, a Zinfandel from a neighboring vineyard, made by an old man who still crushed the grapes with a manual press. It was not a perfect wine. It had sediment. It was a bit too high in alcohol, but it was honest. He poured a glass and walked out onto the back veranda. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, purple shadows across the valley. The air was cooling rapidly, bringing with it the scent of the eucalyptus trees that lined the driveway. He sat in the teak chair and looked out at his empire. It was smaller now. He had sold the private jet. He had sold the penthouse in Manhattan. He had liquidated the shell companies Grant had set up. The forensic accountants were still untangling the last of the financial knots, but the bleeding had stopped. The winery was solvent. It was smaller, leaner, and infinitely stronger. He brought the glass to his nose. He closed his eyes and inhaled. He smelled the blackberry jam. He smelled the black pepper. He smelled the dust of the dry creek bed where the grapes had grown. And he smelled the absence of fear. For 2 years, his sense of smell had been his secret weapon, a curse that forced him to inhale the scent of his own betrayal every day. He had smelled Grant's cologne on his wife. He had smelled the fear in their sweat. He had smelled the metallic tang of the lies. It had been a sensory overload of pain. Now, the air was neutral. The scent of Laurel's jasmine perfume, which had once haunted every room in the house, had finally faded, scrubbed away by lemon oil and time. The ghost of Grant's cigar smoke was gone from the study. Scott took a sip of the wine. The tannins coated his tongue, rough and gripping. It tasted of life. He thought about them then, for what he decided would be the last time. He thought about Laurel, sitting in a cell 300 miles away, wearing a uniform that erased her individuality, surrounded by women who did not care about her gala committees or her dress size. He thought about Grant, navigating the brutal hierarchy of a federal penitentiary, a place where his charm and his business degrees were worthless currency. He did not feel joy at the image. He did not feel the surge of triumph he had felt in the courtroom. He simply felt nothing. They were like a vintage that had turned to vinegar. You do not hate the vinegar. You simply pour it down the drain and wash the bottle. They were waste. And a good winemaker does not mourn the waste. He composts it and moves on. Goodbye, Scott whispered to the empty air. He set the glass down on the railing. He stood up and looked at the driveway. His car was parked there, not the chauffeured limousine Laurel had insisted upon, but his old 1968 convertible, the one he used to drive before the money became a burden. The top was down. He walked down the steps, the gravel crunching under his boots. He did not look back at the house. He did not check his phone. The board meeting was tomorrow. The planting schedule was set. The future was organized. But tonight, the air was perfect. The temperature was dropping to the mid-50s. Perfect for the vines, perfect for a drive. Scott slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cracked and worn, smelling of old sun and gasoline. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a throaty, mechanical growl that vibrated through his chest. It was a real sound, mechanical and true. He shifted into gear and pulled out onto the long driveway. As he passed the gate, he saw the sign, Wainwright Vineyards, EST underneath. Someone, probably Elena, had freshly painted the words, under renovation. Scott smiled. It was the most beautiful thing he had seen in years. He turned onto the Silverado Trail, heading north, away from the city, away from the courts, away from the memories. The wind whipped through his hair, cold and biting, rushing into his lungs, cleansing him of the last stagnant air of the past. He pressed the accelerator, and the car surged forward into the twilight. The billionaire who had let them judge him was gone. The husband who had played the fool was gone. The victim was gone. Driving the car was just a man, a winemaker, and the harvest was going to be magnificent. In the end, the vineyard was clean and the mask was off. This story reminds us that integrity is like a good rootstock. It survives the harshest winters and the cruelest storms. Laurel and Grant chased the quick money and the shallow appearance of success, and it cost them their freedom. Scott chose the hard path, the honest path, and he walked away with his soul intact. It is a powerful lesson that while lies may sprint, the truth runs a marathon. What was your favorite moment of Scott's revenge? Was it the wine tasting or the dossier reveal? Type Team Scott in the comments if you think justice was served. And before you go, I want to connect with you. Tell me in the comments what state or country you are representing today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into psychological warfare and romance, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have a new story coming up that is even more shocking than this one. So tap that next video and let's keep the journey going.